A couple of weeks ago, I posted a video, and in that video, I talked about the fact that I'd been struggling with various things. I don't even remember specifically what I said now, but I think I'd been tired and a little bit ill. I'd probably had a rejection email. I was probably getting lower numbers than I wanted on a video. I remember very vividly that I recorded the whole video once and just lost faith in it. At the kind of last sentence of the video, I was like, I don't know if I really believe what I'm saying here. I don't really know if I have faith in the words that I've just spoken. And I knew that, and I knew that would come across, but I also couldn't bring myself to record it again. But I did. I powered through and I recorded it a second time. And honestly, I just thought, this is a bit of a shit video. I'm whinging a bit. I need a kick up the arse. But I'm going to post it anyway because I promised to be authentic, and I promised not to just like post here's me on a jet to Dubai living on a yacht with all these supermodels. I didn't want to be that guy that was just, pretending to live this luxurious life. I have a really great life, but the process that I'm going through now is challenging. Anyway, I'm waffling on. The point is, I posted that video and it was difficult because I felt vulnerable in it. And a friend of mine saw it. Yes, a friend. I've got friends, all right? Leave it out. Just because I play video games and post videos on the internet of me whinging and moaning doesn't mean I haven't got IRL friends. And yes, I said IRL. That's more to my friends than it is to you guys. They will roast me for saying something like IRL. Anyway, this friend of mine said to me, hey, I'm sorry to hear you're struggling. I've sent you a book that I think will help you. And he said, it's a book that's about writing, but you can ignore the writing specific stuff because there's lots of great advice just for creatives in general. And when the book arrived, it made me laugh. It was this book here. It's called Bird by Bird, Instructions on Writing and Life, and it's by Anne Lamott. Now, this is quite a famous book. I had certainly heard of it. I think I heard of it from Tim Ferriss, the guy who wrote the 4-Hour Workweek, because he hates the process of writing, and this is the book that got him through that. And I'd heard multiple other writers recommend it. So anytime I came across someone in my life who was trying to be a writer or trying to get better at writing, I always bought them this book because I trusted the people who had recommended it, and I'd heard nothing but great things about it, and I thought it would help them. But I had never actually read it myself. I just had faith that it would serve the people who got handed it. And there's a special kind of arrogance there from me that I bought the book for other people, like some kind of wise Buddha type figure handing out wisdom. Read this, take that. I think this will be helpful for you. But I'd never actually sat down and read it for myself. And after reading the introduction, I'm convinced that this is a book that every creative on the planet should read, regardless of where they are, because I think it has some of the most important advice I've ever received as a creative. And even though what I do fundamentally is make videos, there's still lots of applicable stuff in this that is massively important to me in terms of how, it's not just about how to write, it's about how to create sustainably, I think. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to read the introduction as best as I possibly can. And I think there's enough in there that should convince you to go out and buy this book. If you haven't read it already, I think you should go out and get it if you're a creative, or if you're a creator, if you feel overwhelmed by your projects, if you feel like you're struggling. Even if you're not a creative, I think there's important stuff in this book. It is just funny and endearing and informative and all the wonderful things. Anyway, I'm going to read you the introduction, and then you can judge for yourself why I think this is one of the most important books for creatives on the planet. Here we go. I grew up around a father and a mother who read every chance they got, who took us to the library every Thursday night to load up on books for the coming week. Most nights after dinner, my father stretched out on the couch to read while my mother sat with her book in the easy chair, and the three of us kids retired to our own private reading stations. Our house was very quiet after dinner, unless that is some of my father's writer friends were over. My father was a writer, as were most of the men with whom he hung out. They were not the quietest people on earth, but they were mostly very masculine and kind. Usually in the afternoon, when the day's work was done, they hung out at a no-name bar in Sausalito. But sometimes they came to our house for drinks and ended up staying for supper. I loved them, but every so often, one of them would pass out at the dinner table. I was an anxious child to begin with, and I found this unnerving. Every morning, no matter how late he had been up, my father rose at 5:30, went to his study, wrote for a couple of hours, made us all breakfast, read the paper with my mother, and then went back to work for the rest of the morning. Many years passed before I realized that he did this by choice, for a living, and that he was not unemployed or mentally ill. I wanted him to have a regular job where he put on a necktie and went off somewhere with the other fathers and sat in little offices and smoked. But the idea of spending entire days in someone else's office doing someone else's work did not suit my father's soul. I think it would have killed him. He did end up dying rather early in his mid-50s, but at least he had lived on his own terms. So I grew up around this man who sat at his desk in the study all day and wrote books and articles about the places and people he had seen and known. He read a lot of poetry. Sometimes he travelled. He could go any place he wanted with a sense of purpose. One of the gifts of being a writer is that it gives you an excuse to do things, to go places and explore. Another thing is that writing motivates you to look closely at life as it lurches by and tramps around. Writing taught my father to pay attention. My father in turn taught other people to pay attention and then to write down their thoughts and observations. His students were prisoners at San Quentin who took part in the creative writing program, but he taught me too, mostly by example. He taught the prisoners and me to put a little bit down on paper every day and to read all the great books and plays we could get our hands on. He taught us to read poetry. He taught us to be bold and original and let ourselves make mistakes, and that Thurber was right when he said you might as well fall flat on your face as lean over too far backwards. But while he helped the prisoner and me to discover that we had a lot of feelings and observations and memories and dreams and God knows opinions we wanted to share, we all ended up just the tiniest bit resentful when we found out the one fly in the ointment, that at some point we actually had to sit down and write. I believe writing was easier for me than for the prisoners because I was still a child, but I always found it hard. I started writing when I was 7 or 8. I was very shy and strange looking, loved reading about everything else, weighed about 40 pounds at the time, and was so tense that I walked around with my shoulders up to my ears like Richard Nixon. I saw a home movie once of a birthday party I went to in the 1st grade, with all these cute little boys and girls playing together like puppies, and all of a sudden, I scuttled across the screen like Prufrock's crab. I was very clearly one who was going to grow up to be a serial killer or keep dozens and dozens of cats. Instead, I got funny. I got funny because boys, older boys I didn't even know, would ride by on their bikes and taunt me about my weird looks. Each time felt like a drive-by shooting. I think this is why I walk like Nixon. I think I was trying to plug my ears with my shoulders, but they wouldn't quite reach. So first I got funny and then I started to write, although I didn't always write funny things. The first poem I wrote that got any attention was about John Glenn. The first stanza went, Colonel John Glenn went up to heaven in his spaceship, Friendship 7. The teacher read the John Glenn poem to my 2nd grade class. It was a great moment. The other children looked at me as though I had learned to drive. It turned out that the teacher had submitted the poem to a California state school competition and it won some sort of award. I understood immediately the thrill of seeing oneself in print. It provides some sort of primal verification. You are in print, therefore you exist. Who knows what this urge is all about, to appear somewhere outside yourself, instead of feeling stuck inside your muddled but stroboscopic mind, peering out like a little undersea animal, a spiny blenny, for instance, from inside your tiny cave. Seeing yourself in print is such an amazing concept. You can get so much attention without having to actually show up somewhere. While others who have something to say or who want to be effectual, like musicians or baseball players or politicians, have to get out there in front of people. Writers who tend to be shy get to stay home and still be public. There are many obvious advantages to this. You don't have to dress up, for instance, and you can't hear them boo you right away. Sometimes I got to sit on the floor of my father's study and write my poems while he sat at his desk writing his books. Every couple of years, another book of his was published. Books were revered in our house and great writers admired above everyone else. Special books got displayed prominently on the coffee table, on the radio, on the back of the John. I grew up reading the blurbs on dust jackets and the reviews of my father's books in the papers. All of this made me start wanting to be a writer when I grew up, to be artistic, a free spirit, and yet also to be the rare working class person in charge of her own life. Still, I was worried there was never quite enough money at our house. I worried that my father was going to turn into a bum like some of his writer friends. I remember when I was 10 years old, my father published a piece in a magazine that mentioned his having spent an afternoon on a porch at Stinson Beach with a bunch of other writers, and that they had all been drinking lots of red wine and smoking marijuana. No one smoked marijuana in those days except jazz musicians, and they were all also heroin addicts. Fathers were not supposed to be smoking marijuana, they were supposed to be sailing or playing tennis. My friends' fathers, who were teachers and doctors and firefighters and lawyers, did not smoke marijuana. Most of them didn't even drink, and they certainly did not have colleagues who came over and passed out on the table over the tuna casserole. Reading my father's article, I could only imagine that the world was breaking down, and next time I burst into my dad's study to show him my report card, he'd be crouched under the desk with one of my mother's nylon stockings knotted around his upper arm, looking up at me like a cornered wolf. All I ever wanted was to belong, to wear that hat of belonging. In the 7th and 8th grade, I still weighed about 40 pounds. I was 12 years old and had been getting teased about my strange look most of my life. This is a difficult country to look too different in, the United States of advertising, as Paul Krasner puts it. And if you're too skinny or too tall or too dark or too weird or short or frizzy or homely or poor or nearsighted, you get crucified. I did. But I was funny, so the popular kids let me hang out with them, go to their parents and watch them neck with each other. This, as you might imagine, did not help my self-esteem a great deal. I thought I was a total loser, but one day I took my notebook and a pen when I went to Bolinas Beach with my father, who was not, as far as I could tell, shooting drugs yet. With the Rhino equivalent of a canvas and brush, I wrote a description of what I saw. I walked to the lip of the water and let the foamy tongue of the rushing liquid lick my toes. A sand crab burrowed a hole a few inches from my foot and then disappeared into the damp sand. I'll spare you the rest. It goes on for quite a while. My father convinced me to show it to a teacher, and it ended up being included in a real textbook. One of the popular girls came home with me after school one day to spend the night. We found my parents rejoicing over the arrival of my dad's new novel, the first copy off the press. We were also thrilled and proud, and this girl seemed to think I had the coolest possible father, a writer. Her father sold cars. We went to dinner where we all toasted one another. Things in the family just couldn't have been better. And here was a friend to witness it. Then one night before we went to sleep, I picked up the new novel and began to read the first page to my friend. We were lying side by side in sleeping bags on my floor. The first page turned out to be about a man and woman in bed together having sex. The man was playing with a woman's nipple. I began to giggle with mounting hysteria. Oh, this is great, I thought, beaming jocularly to my friend. I covered my mouth with one hand, like a blushing Charlie Chaplin, and pantomimed that I was about to toss a silly book over my shoulder. This is wonderful, I thought, throwing back my head to laugh jovially. My father writes pornography. In the dark, I glowed like a light bulb with shame. You could have read by me. I never mentioned the book to my father, although over the next couple of years, I went through it late at night, looking for more sexy parts, of which there were a number. It was very confusing. It made me feel very scared and sad. Then a strange thing happened. My father wrote an article for a magazine called A Lousy Place to Raise Kids, and it was about Marion County, and specifically the community where we lived, which is as beautiful a place as one can imagine. Yet the people on our peninsula were second only to the Native Americans in the slums of Oakland in the rate of alcoholism, and the drug abuse amongst teenagers was, as my father wrote, soul-chilling, and there was rampant divorce and mental breakdown and wayward sexual behaviour. My father wrote disparagingly about the men in the community, their values and materialistic frenzy, and about their wives. These estimable women, the wives of doctors, architects and lawyers in tennis dresses and cotton frocks, tanned and well preserved, wandering the aisles of our supermarkets with glints of madness in their eyes. No one in our town came off looking great. This is the tragedy of California, he wrote in the last paragraph. For a life oriented to leisure is in the end a life oriented to death, the greatest leisure of all. There's just one problem. I was an avid tennis player. The tennis ladies were my friends. I practiced every afternoon at the same tennis club as they, and I sat with them on the weekends and waited for the men who had priority to be done so we could get on the courts. And now my father had made them look like decadent zombies. I thought we were ruined, but my older brother came home from school that week with a photocopy of my father's article that his teachers in both social studies and English had passed out to their classes. John was a hero to his classmates. There was an enormous response in the community. In the next few months, I was snubbed by a number of men and women at the tennis club, but at the same time, people stopped my father on the street when we were walking together and took his hand in both of theirs as if he had done them some personal favour. Later that summer, I came to know how they felt when I read The Catcher in the Rye for the first time and knew what it was like to have someone speak for me, to close a book with a sense of both triumph and release, one lonely, isolated, social animal finally making contact. I started writing a lot in high school, journals, impassioned anti-war pieces, parodies of writers I loved. I began to notice something important. The other kids always wanted me to tell them stories of what had happened, even or especially when they had been there. Parties that got away from us, blow-ups in the classroom or in the schoolyard, scenes involving their parents that we had witnessed. I could make that story happen. I could make it vivid and funny and even exaggerate some of it so that the event became almost mythical and the people involved seemed larger and there was a sense of larger significance of meaning. I'm sure my father was the person on whom his friends relied to tell their stories in school and college. I know for sure that he was later in the town where he was raising his children. He could take major events or small episodes from daily life and shade or exaggerate things in such a way as to capture their shape and substance, capture what life felt like in the society in which he and his friends lived and worked and bred. People looked to him to put into words what was going on. I suspect he was a child who thought differently to his peers, who may have had serious conversations with grown-ups who, as a young person, like me, accepted being alone quite a lot. I think this sort of person often becomes either a writer or a career criminal. Throughout my childhood, I believed that what I thought about was different from what other kids thought about. I was not necessarily more profound, but there was a struggle going inside me to find something, some sort of creative or spiritual or aesthetic way of seeing the world and organising it in my head. I read more than other kids. I luxuriated in books. Books were my refuge. I sat in corners with my little fingers hooked over my bottom lip, reading in a trance, lost in the places and times to which books took me. And there was a moment during my junior year in high school when I began to believe that I could do what other writers were doing. I came to believe that I might be able to put a pencil in my hand and make something magical happen. Then I wrote some terrible, terrible stories. In college, the whole world opened up, and the books and poets being taught in my English class and philosophy classes gave me the feeling for the first time in my life that there was hope. Hope that I might find my place in a community. I felt that in my strange new friends and in certain new books, I was meeting my other half. Some people wanted to get rich or famous, but my friends and I wanted to get real. We wanted to get deep. Also, I suppose, we wanted to get laid. I devoured books like a person taking vitamins, afraid that otherwise I would remain this gelatinous narcissist with no possibility of ever becoming thoughtful or ever being taken seriously. I became a socialist for 5 weeks. Then the bus ride to my socialist meetings wore me out. I was drawn to oddballs, ethnic people, theatre people, poets, radicals, gays and lesbians, and somehow they all helped me become some of those things I wanted so desperately to become: political, intellectual, artistic. My friends turned me on to Kierkegaard, Beckett, Doris, Lessing. I swooned with excitement and nourishment of it all. I remember reading C.S. Lewis for the first time, surprised by joy, and how, looking inside himself, he found a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. I started writing sophomoric articles for the college paper. Luckily, I was a sophomore. I was incompetent in all college ways except one. I got the best grades in English. I wrote the best papers, but I was ambitious. I wanted to be recognised on a larger scale, so I dropped out at 19 to become a famous writer. I moved back to San Francisco and became a famous Kelly girl instead. I was famous for my incompetence and weepiness. I wept with boredom and disbelief. Then I landed a job as a clerk typist at a huge engineering and construction firm in the city, in the nuclear quality assurance department, where I laboured under a tsunami wave of triplicate forms and memos. It was very upsetting. I finally figured out that most of this paperwork could be tossed without there being any real, fallout. And this freed me up to write short stories instead. Do it every day for a while, my father kept saying. Do it as you would scales on a piano. Do it by pre-arrangement with yourself. Do it as a debt of honour and make a commitment to finish things. So in addition to writing furtively at the office, I wrote every night for an hour or more, often in coffee houses with a notepad and my pen, drinking great quantities of wine because this is what writers do. This is what my father and all his friends did. I worked for them, although there was now a new and disturbing trend. They had started committing suicide. This was very painful for my father, of course, but we both kept writing. I eventually moved out to Bolinas, where my father and younger brother had moved the year before when my parents had split up. I began to teach tennis and clean houses for a living. Every day for a couple of years, I wrote little snippets and vignettes, but mainly I concentrated on my magnum opus, a short story called Arnold. A bold, bearded psychiatrist named Arnold is hanging out one day with a slightly depressed younger female writer and a slightly depressed younger brother. Arnold gives them all sorts of helpful psychological advice, but then at the end gives up, gets down on his haunches and waddles around quacking like a duck to amuse them. This is a theme I've always loved, where a couple of totally hopeless cases run into someone like a clown or a foreigner who gives them a little spin for a while and who says in effect, "I'm lost too, but look, I know how to catch rabbits." It was a terrible story. I wrote a lot of other things too. I took notes on the people around me, in my town, in my family, in my memory. I took notes on my own state of mind, my grandiosity, the low self-esteem. I wrote down the funny stuff I overheard. I learned to be like a ship's rat, veined ears trembling, and I learned to scribble it all down. But mostly I worked on my short story, Arnold. Every few months I would send it to my father's agent in New York, Elizabeth McKee. "Well," she'd write back, "it's really coming along now." I wanted to be published so badly. I heard a preacher say recently that hope is a revolutionary patience. Let me add that so is being a writer. Hope begins in the dark, the stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait and watch and work, and you don't give up. I didn't give up largely because my father's faith in me. And then, unfortunately, when I was 23, I suddenly had a story to tell. My father was diagnosed with brain cancer. He and my brothers and I were devastated, but somehow we managed, just barely, to keep our heads above water. My father told me to pay attention and to take notes. "You tell your version," he said, "and I'm going to tell mine." I began to write about what my father was going through and then began to shape these writings into connected short stories. I wove in all the vignettes and snippets I'd been working on in the year before Dad's diagnosis and came up with 5 chapters that sort of hung together. My father, who was too sick to write his own rendition, loved them and had me ship them off to Elizabeth, our agent. And then I waited and waited and waited, growing old and withered in the course of a month. But I think she must have read them in a state of near euphoria, thrilled to find herself not reading Arnold. She is not a religious woman by any stretch, but I always picture her clutching those stories to her chest, eyes closed, swaying slightly, moaning, "Thank you, Lord." She sent them around New York and Viking made an offer, and thus the process began. The book came out when I was 26, when my father had been dead for a year. God, I had a book published. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of, and I reached nirvana, right? Well, I believed before I sold my first book that publication would be instantly and automatically gratifying, an affirming and romantic experience, a hallmark commercial where one runs and leaps in slow motion across a meadow filled with wildflowers into the arms of acclaim and self-esteem. That did not happen for me. The months before the book came out of the shoot are, for most writers, right up there with the worst life has to offer. Pretty much like the first 20 minutes of Apocalypse Now, with Martin Sheen in a motel room in Saigon, totally decompensating. The waiting and the fantasies, both happy and grim, wear you down. Plus, there is the matter of early reviews that come out about 2 months before publication. The first 2 notices I got on the tender book I'd written about my dying, now dead father said that my book was a total waste of time, a boring, sentimental, self-indulgent sack of spider's puke. That's not verbatim. It was a little edgy for the first 6 weeks, as you can imagine. I had lots and lots of drinks every night and told lots of strangers at bars about how my dad had died and I'd written the book about it and how the early reviews had criticised it. And then I'd start to cry and need a few more drinks, and I'd end up telling them about this great dog we had named Llewellyn, who had to be put to sleep when I was 12, which made me even so sad to think about it. I'd tell my audience that it was all I could do not to go into the restroom and blow my brains out. Then the book came out. I got some terrific reviews in important places and a few bad ones. There were a few book signing parties, a few interviews, and a number of important people claimed to love it. But overall, it seemed that I was not in fact going to be taking early retirement. I secretly believed that trumpets would blare, major reviewers would proclaim that not since Moby Dick had an American novel so captured life in all of its dizzying complexity. And this is what I thought when my second book came out, and my third, and my fourth, and my fifth, and each time I was wrong. But I still encourage anyone who feels compelled to write to do so. I just warn people who hope to get published that publication is not all it's cracked up to be. But writing is. Writing has so much to give, so much to teach, so many surprises. That thing you had to force yourself to do, the actual act of writing, turns out to be the best part. It's like discovering that while you thought you needed the tea ceremony for the caffeine, what you really needed was the tea ceremony. The act of writing turns out to be its own reward. I've managed to get some work done nearly every day of my adult life without impressive financial success, yet I would do it all over again in a hot second, mistakes and doldrums and breakdowns and all. Sometimes I could not tell you exactly why, especially when it feels pointless and pitiful, like Sisyphus with cash flow problems. Other days, though, my writing is like a person to me, a person who, after all these years, still makes sense to me. It reminds me of The Wild Rose, a poem Wendell Berry wrote for his wife. Sometimes hidden from me in daily custom and in trust, so that I live by you unaware as by the beating of my heart. Suddenly you flare in my sight, a wild rose blooming at the edge of thicket, grace and light, where yesterday was only shade. And once again I am blessed, choosing again what I choose before. Ever since I was a little kid, I thought there was something noble and mysterious about writing, about people who could do it well, who could create a world as if they were little gods or sorcerers. All my life I felt there was something magical about people who could get into other people's minds and skin, who could take people like me out of ourselves and then take us back to ourselves. And you know what? I still do. So now I teach. This just sort of happened. Someone offered me a gig teaching a writing workshop about 10 years ago, and I've been teaching writing classes ever since. But you can't teach writing, people tell me. And I say, who the hell are you? God's dean of admissions? If people show up in one of my classes and want to learn to write or to write better, I can tell them everything that has helped me along the way and what it's like for me on a daily basis. I can teach them little things that may not be in any of the great books on writing. For instance, I'm not sure if anyone else has mentioned that December is traditionally a bad month for writing. It's a month of Mondays. Mondays are not good days for writing. One has had all the freedom over the weekend, all that authenticity, all those dreamy dreams, and then your angry, mute, Slavic uncle Monday arrives and it's time to sit down at your desk. So I would simply recommend to people in my workshops that they never start a large writing project on any Monday in December. Why set yourself up for failure? Interviewers ask famous writers why they write, and if I remember correctly, the poet John Ashbery, who answered because I want to, Flannery O'Connor answered because I'm good at it, and when the occasional interviewer asks me, I quote them both. Then I add that other than writing, I'm completely unemployable. But really, secretly, when I'm not being smart alecky, it's because I want to and because I'm good at it. I always mention a scene from the movie Chariots of Fire in which, as I remember it, the Scottish runner Eric Liddell, who is the hero, is walking along with his missionary sister on a gorgeous heathery hillside in Scotland. She is nagging him to give up training for the Olympics and get back to doing his missionary work at their church's mission in China. And he replies that he wants to go to China because he feels it is God's will for him, but that first he is going to train with all of his art because God also made him very, very fast. So God made some of us fast in this area of working with words, and he gave us the gift of loving to read with the same kind of passion with which we love nature. My students at writing workshops have this gift of loving to read, and some of them are really fast, really good with words, and some of them aren't really fast and don't write well at all, but they still love good writing and they just want to write. And I say, hey, that is good enough for me. Come on down. So I tell them what it will be like for me at the desk the next morning when I sit down to work, with a few ideas and a lot of blank paper, with hideous conceit and low self-esteem in equal measures, fingers poised on the keyboard. I tell them they'll want to be really good right off, and they may not be, but they might be good someday if they just keep the faith and keep practicing. And they may even go from wanting to have written something to just wanting to be writing, wanting to be working on something. Like they want to be playing the piano or tennis, because writing brings with it so much joy, so much challenge. It is work and play together. When they're working on their books or their stories, their heads will spin with ideas and invention. They'll see the world through new eyes. Everything they see and hear and learn will become grist for the mill. At cocktail parties or in the line at the post office, they will be gleaning small moments and overheard expressions. They'll sneak away to scribble these things down. They'll have days at the desk of frantic boredom or angry hopelessness of wanting to quit forever. And there will be days when it feels like they have caught and are riding a wave. And then I tell my students that the odds of getting published and of it bringing them financial security, peace of mind, and even joy are probably not that great. Ruin, hysteria, bad skin, unsightly tics, ugly financial problems, maybe, but probably not peace of mind. I tell them that I think they ought to write anyway, but I try to make sure they understand that writing and even getting good at it and having books and stories and articles published will not open the doors that most of them hope for. It will not make them well. It will not give them the feeling that the world has finally validated their parking tickets, that they have in fact finally arrived. My writer friends, and they are legion, do not go around beaming with quiet feelings of contentment. Most of them go around with haunted, abused, surprised looks on their faces, like lab dogs on whom very personal deodorant sprays have been tested. My students do not want to hear this, nor do they want to hear that it wasn't until my fourth book came out that I stopped being a starving artist. They do not want to hear that most of them probably won't get published and that even fewer will make it enough to live on. But their fantasies of what it means to be published has very little to do with reality. So I tell them about my 4-year-old son, Sam, who goes to a little Christian preschool where he recently learned the story of Thanksgiving. A friend of his, who is also named Sam, but is 12 years old and very political, asked my Sam to tell him everything he knew about the holiday. So my Sam told him this lovely Christian preschool version of Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans and lots of lovely food and feelings, at which point Big Sam turned to me and said, somewhat bitterly, I guess he hasn't heard about the smallpox-infested blankets yet. Now, maybe we weren't handing out those blankets yet, but maybe we're still on our good behaviour. But the point is that my students, who so want to be published, have not yet heard about the smallpox-infested blanket of getting published. So that's one of the things I tell them. But I also tell them that sometimes when my writer friends are working, they feel better and more alive than they do at any other time. And sometimes when they're writing well, they feel like they're living up to something. It's as if the right words, the true words, are already inside them and they just want to help them get out. Writing this way is a little like milking a cow. The milk is so rich and delicious and the cow is so glad you did it. I want people to come to my classes to have that feeling too. So I tell them everything I've been thinking or talking about lately that has helped me get my work done. There are some quotes and examples from other writers that have inspired me and that I hand out every session. There are some things my friends remind me of when I call them, worried, bored, discouraged, and trying to scrounge together cab fare to the bridge. What follows in this book is what I've learned along the way, what I pass along to each new batch of students. This is not like other writing books, some of which are terrific. It's more personal, more like my classes. As of today, here is almost every single thing I know about writing. But I know that's very long. I know this is probably not YouTube material. But there's some absolute gems just in the introduction of this book. The line where she talks about how her father got up at 5:30 every morning and went to his study, wrote for a couple of hours and made them all breakfast. And that it was many years before that she realized that he did this by choice for a living and that he was not unemployed or mentally ill. I want my kids to see me like that. Her father and her in turn built a life that was centered around this specific thing. And the work that they have produced was impactful to people on small and big scales. And I want my work to be impactful for people. When I make a video, when I stream, when I do anything, if I'm writing a blog, whatever I'm doing, these vlogs specifically, I want it to feel like it's being impactful for people. I want my work to feel important and I want to do it every day. And I don't mind if doing it means I have to be a starving artist. There's so much in this that means so much to me. And there's so much of it that is like holding up a mirror to myself. And I'm sure lots of people who read it see lots of themselves in it as well. But I think if you're a creative and you feel overwhelmed, the next chapters of this book will help you feel less overwhelmed. The whole concept of this book is that you can get through things little by little. And if you just work on your craft every single day, even for a little bit, and you do that by pre-arrangement with yourself, you set yourself a target or a time or something to say, I'm going to do this thing for this amount of time and have faith that it will get better. I'm going to observe the things around me. I'm going to communicate what I'm passionate about. All of those things, if I do that every single day, then I will get better at it. Maybe one day I'll get so good at it that people will pay me. And maybe one day I'll get so good at it that it makes me financially stable and that my work is impactful. But the money has to come after, I think. And that's really difficult. It is a really difficult place to be because, you know, we all have responsibilities. We all have mortgages to pay. But, you know, it doesn't mean that we don't do things on the side to support ourselves. It doesn't mean that we don't have jobs. You know, I think for a good portion of my last job, I spent time thinking about this stuff that I'm doing today, making videos, writing things, producing things. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're writing videos or you're an artist or you're a writer or a producer or a videographer or a tech enthusiast or a gamer. Get this book. It's so good. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys got something from that. I felt an urge to share it with you. Thank you to my friend for buying it for me and showing me how arrogant I was for not buying it for myself so many years ago after sharing it with so many other people. I appreciate you guys watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys on the next one.